The Harlan County Resettlement Office operated out of a converted livery stable on the west end of Dodge Falls, Kansas, and it smelled exactly like what it had always been, a place where animals had been traded and where that tradition had simply changed its inventory. The walls were rough-cut timber, the floor worn smooth by decades of boots, and at the far end of the room, someone had nailed a hand-painted sign that read Harlan County Placement and Relief Services in letters that had been retouched so many times they'd begun to bleed into each other at the edges. Elias Croft sat in the last row. He had chosen that seat the way he chose most things, deliberately, without explaining himself to anyone. From the back he could see the whole room, who had come with genuine purpose, and who had come because a Tuesday morning in 1899 offered few better alternatives. He recognized most of the faces. Grain merchants, a cattle broker, two brothers from the Eastern Flats who ran a middling horse operation and always seemed to be looking for something they couldn't quite name. None of them knew what to make of his presence, and he could see them deciding not to ask. He hadn't come because he wanted to be here. He had come because his ranch hand, a lean and perpetually direct man named Amos Greer, had told him 3 weeks prior, over a supper that had been both burned and under-seasoned, that the Croft operation was going to continue falling apart from the inside regardless of how well it ran on the outside. Amos had said this without looking up from his plate, which told Elias the man had been rehearsing it. "You need someone who knows how a house actually works," Amos had said. "The men are eating badly. The storage is a wreck. Half the supplies we order go to waste because nobody's tracking anything." He'd set down his fork. "You're 61 years old, Elias. You built something worth keeping. You ought to have someone help you keep it." Elias had said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. His wife, Nora, had died 6 years ago. His son had gone east for law school and had not come back, which was a grief Elias had decided to carry quietly and without ceremony. The house had been declining since, slowly and without drama, the way things decline when no one is paying them the right kind of attention. So here he was, sitting in the back row of a livery stable-turned-placement office, watching a red-faced man named Gerald Poole work through a list of names with the efficiency of someone who had made his peace with the work a long time ago. Most of the transactions were businesslike. A widower with 4 young children took a woman in her 40s who appeared to have already done her calculations and was satisfied with the result. A farmer from north of the flats took a woman barely past 30 who kept her eyes on her own hands and said almost nothing. Then Poole called the name Clara Voss. She came out from behind the side partition without hesitation, and that was the first thing Elias noticed. Not her face, not her dress, but the quality of her movement. She didn't walk the way women walked when they were trying to appear composed. She walked the way people walk when they've stopped caring what the room thinks of them and are simply moving from one place to the next. She was young, 26, according to the sheet Poole had distributed, dark-haired, with the kind of stillness in her expression that comes not from peace but from long practice at managing what showed on her face. She carried a worn leather satchel, which she set down at her feet with a precision that seemed deliberate, like putting down something she intended to pick up again. Poole cleared his throat. Clara Voss, formerly of Wichita, before that of Abilene. Widowed once, no children. She's in good health, educated. She was a schoolteacher before her circumstances changed. He glanced at the sheet. Starting bid, $50. The room did something that wasn't quite silence. It was a specific kind of quiet, the quiet of men who had already decided. Elias watched it happen. He watched Poole try $40, then $30. He watched the cattle broker examine his own fingernails. He watched the brothers from the Eastern Flats exchange a look that communicated something they'd agreed on before they'd walked in. "She's educated," the grain merchant near the front said, with the tone of a man identifying a complication rather than a virtue. "Women like that are trouble to manage." On the platform, Clara Voss did not look at the man who said it. She was looking at the far wall, at a fixed point above the assembled heads, and her jaw was set in a way that was almost invisible unless you were specifically looking for it. Elias was looking for it. He recognized that jaw. He had seen it on men who were holding something down with the last of what they had. $20, Poole tried, with an edge of genuine discomfort now. Surely someone... $1. Elias stood up. Every head in the room turned. He was a big man, not tall, but dense, built over 6 decades of physical work into something that took up space in a room with or without his cooperation. He let the silence run for a moment. $1, he said again, for a conversation. That's all I'm buying. The confusion in the room was immediate. He could see it moving across the faces: offense, suspicion, the particular resentment of men who had decided something had no value and were being told they were wrong. "That's not," Poole began. "I know what it's not," Elias said evenly. "I'm proposing to speak with this woman plainly about what I need and what I can offer, and I'm willing to pay $1 for that opportunity. If she hears it and says no, she says no. If Poole wants the $1, he can have it." He looked directly at Clara Voss for the first time, and she was already looking at him, not at the wall anymore. 5 minutes. Poole looked at the $1 Elias had already set on his own chair and did the arithmetic of a man who understands that some transactions are better concluded than prolonged. 5 minutes, he said. They went outside, to the narrow alley along the building's north side, away from the door. The Kansas wind came off the flats with nothing between it and them, pushing Clara's skirt against her legs and lifting a strand of hair she tucked back behind her ear with a single efficient gesture. She held the satchel with both hands and waited for him to speak. He appreciated that she didn't fill the silence. "My name is Elias Croft," he said. "I run a cattle and grain operation about 18 miles east. 4,200 acres, 40-odd head, a working house that has been declining for 6 years because nobody's been running it properly." He put his hands in his coat pockets. "I'm not going to dress this up. I need a capable partner who can manage the domestic side of the operation with real authority, not decorative presence, actual work." Clara looked at him with an expression that was doing several things at once. Assessing, calculating, deciding how much to reveal. "You said partner," she said. Her voice was lower and steadier than he'd expected. "I mean it the way it sounds. Most men don't." "I'm aware," he said. "I've had one marriage, and she was a full partner in everything, and that operation ran well because of it, and when she died, it stopped running well. That's the situation." She studied him. "You want a replacement?" "I want what I had," he said honestly, which was someone who was smarter than me about half of what mattered and wasn't shy about saying so. Whether this becomes that depends on both of us. "I'm not making promises about what I don't know yet." Something shifted in her face. Not softening, she didn't soften, but a recalibration, like a scale settling. "I was a teacher," she said. 7 years, in 2 counties. I know figures, correspondence, supply management, how to handle people who don't want to be handled." She looked at him directly. "My husband died 14 months ago. He was not a kind man, and I am not going to discuss the details, except to tell you that the experience showed me very clearly what the difference looks like between a man who treats you as a person and a man who treats you as property he happens to house." She lifted her chin slightly. "I am not going to perform gratitude. I'm not going to be decorative. I'll work and I'll tell you when I think you're wrong, and I'll expect to be heard." "Good," Elias said. "I'm wrong with some regularity." A pause. The wind moved between them. "What does this look like practically?" she asked. "You'd have full authority over the household and its accounts. The men who work the property would treat you with respect or they'd be gone. I'd expect honest dealing, no pretending things are fine when they aren't." He met her eyes. "I'm proposing a legal arrangement. What it grows into beyond that depends on what both of us choose. I can't tell you what I feel because I don't know yet. I know what I need, and I've told you." Clara Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then she set her satchel down on the hard ground, and something about the deliberateness of that small action told him she had made a decision. "I'll hear your $1's worth," she said. "Let's go sign whatever needs signing." They went back inside and signed Poole's papers at the folding table, and several of the men watched this with expressions ranging from puzzlement to the specific resentment of people who've assessed something as worthless and been publicly contradicted. Elias paid Poole the $1, a real silver $1 that he set on the table with a flat, clean sound. Clara signed her name in a clear and unhurried hand. Clara Ann Voss, and then the date. And then she straightened and picked up her satchel without waiting to be told to. Outside, the wagon was waiting. Elias's man, a young hand named Pete, had been waiting with the horses and was making no effort to conceal his curiosity. He looked at Clara, then at the satchel, then at Elias, and appeared to decide that his job was the horses. "It's about 2 hours," Elias said, meaning the drive. "All right," Clara said. She climbed up onto the wagon without waiting for assistance. Not a statement simply practical, the movement of someone who had been climbing into wagons since childhood and had never thought of it as a ceremony. They pulled out onto the road. The livery stable got small behind them. The Kansas land opened ahead in its late October colors, the dry gold of harvested fields and the pale silver of grass the frost had taken, enormous and indifferent in the flat afternoon light. Neither of them spoke for a while. "What's the worst of it?" Clara said eventually, not looking at him, looking out at the land. "The house," he said. "The supplies are ordered without any system, so half of what comes in goes bad before it's used. The men eat worse than they should. The accounts on the domestic side haven't been properly kept in 3 years." He watched the road. "The worst is probably the storage. 2 of my hands have been doubling as cooks, and neither of them should be." "Why did they stay?" "Because Amos, my foreman, runs a good operation on the land side, and the men respect that, and they're willing to tolerate the rest." She turned to look at him. "For now." "For now," he agreed. A pause. She looked back at the road. "I had a classroom of 32 children in Abilene," she said. "Half of them were from families that didn't think girls needed education past sums and scripture. Their fathers told me so directly on more than one occasion." She shifted the satchel on her lap. "I kept the classroom running. I tracked every supply, managed the school board accounts, taught all 8 grades in one room for 4 years." She looked out at the flat horizon. "I can manage a household." "I don't doubt it," Elias said. Another silence. Easier than the first. "What are they going to make of me?" she said. "Your men." "They're going to make whatever they make," Elias said. "Amos will assess you in about 48 hours and tell me his conclusion directly. The rest will follow his lead." He paused. "What they make of you long-term will depend on what you show them. That's the same for everyone." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Evaluating, he thought. Deciding whether the honesty was performance or habit. "Fair enough," she said. The first lights of the Croft operation appeared at the edge of the horizon as the sun dropped a cluster of structures that resolved slowly into something that could be called a working ranch if you were being accurate, or a collection of things that had been built for function rather than appearance, which was the same thing stated more honestly. In fact, the main house was large, 2 stories of good timber, with a wide porch that had weathered unevenly. Behind it, the bunkhouse, 2 barns, a storage shed with a door that didn't hang quite right. Clara looked at it as they approached. She said nothing. Amos Greer was on the porch. He always seemed to know when things were arriving. He watched them pull up with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who has decided to gather information before forming a position. "Amos," Elias said, climbing down. "This is Mrs. Voss. She's taking over the household." Amos looked at Clara. Clara looked at Amos. "You're wondering 3 things," she said to him directly, climbing down from the wagon. "Whether I know what I've walked into, whether I'll last, and whether you're going to have to manage around me the way you've been managing around the hole." She picked up the satchel. "The answers are yes, I don't know, and no." She looked at him levelly. "Where's the storage shed?" Amos blinked. He looked at Elias, who gave him nothing. Then he looked back at Clara. "East side of the house," he said. "But the kitchen's worse." "Show me the kitchen first," she said, "and then the shed." She followed Amos inside without looking back. And Elias stood in the yard and listened to the door close, and thought that Amos had used more words in the last 30 seconds than he typically used in an hour. The kitchen was a disaster with good bones. Clara stood in the center of it and did what she had learned, over years of taking on other people's neglected spaces. To do first, she looked at all of it without flinching. The cast iron range was solid, a good one, but surrounded by chaos. Supplies stacked without system. The cold pantry thin and disorganized, surfaces wiped but never truly cleaned. A smell of rendered fat that had been allowed to build over months. She opened every cabinet. She counted what was there and what was missing, and what was present in quantities that made no sense. In her head, she was already building the list. A young woman appeared in the doorway, 16 or so, freckled, watching Clara with the uncertain attention of someone trying to decide how much wariness the situation required. "You work in here?" Clara asked. "Sometimes. I'm Dottie. I mostly do laundry. Can you cook?" "Badly." Clara looked at her. "At least you know it." She turned back to the pantry. "What do the men eat for breakfast?" "Whatever gets made. Usually corn porridge or biscuits. The biscuits aren't right." "What's wrong with them?" Dottie considered this. "Heavy. Like someone put too much of everything in and hoped for the best." "That's exactly what's wrong with them." Clara said. "Come back at 5 tomorrow morning. We'll do biscuits properly." She closed the pantry. "Tonight I need to see what's available, and then I need every person in this house to eat a meal that was made with actual thought. Where's the flour?" By 7 o'clock, supper appeared on the long table in the dining room. Not elaborate, there hadn't been time or material for elaborate, but hot, organized, and assembled with the specific competence of someone who knew what they were doing. The men filed in and sat down, and there was the ordinary noise of a working supper. And then it got quieter in the way that rooms get quiet when people are registering something without wanting to announce it. Elias sat at the head of the table. Clara sat at the far end, eating without talking, listening to the shape of the conversation, mapping names to faces, noting who deferred to whom, and who was watching her with suspicion versus mere curiosity. Afterward, a hand named Vernon Older, with the weathered patience of someone who had been doing this particular work since before most of the others were born, stopped beside her as she was clearing the end of the table. "That was a decent supper, ma'am," he said. "Thank you," she said. No deflection, no performance of modesty, just acknowledgement. He nodded once and went out, and she heard the bunkhouse door close behind him. Her room was upstairs, across the hall from Elias's, and it was spare but clean. A bed with a good mattress, a writing desk, a window that looked east over the dark flat land. Someone had placed a lamp on the desk with a full reservoir of oil, which told her someone had thought about what she'd need before she arrived. She sat on the edge of the bed and took her boots off and set them by the door. Then she sat with her hands in her lap and let herself be still, which she had not permitted herself all day. She was 26 years old in a house she had never seen before, in a county she barely knew, with a man she had met 8 hours ago. She had a leather satchel, $43 at the bottom of it, and a set of skills she had spent her adult life building without being given particular credit for any of them. She was also, for the first time since she could clearly remember, in a situation that felt like it had been entered into honestly. She wasn't sure what to do with that sensation. It was unfamiliar enough to feel slightly dangerous, the way a road with no ruts feels to someone who has spent years steering around them. She lay down on top of the quilt without changing, because she was too tired to bother, and she looked at the ceiling and thought about the man across the hall, the specific quality of his honesty. It was real. She was certain of that. The way you become certain of things that you have good reason to distrust and distrust anyway, and are then surprised to find solid. He was also a man who had spent years being answerable to no one, and had developed the habit of stating his own needs as though they were simply weather. She thought he could be wrong about a significant number of things without knowing it. She thought she could work with that. She thought about the silver dollar he'd set on Poole's table, the flat sound of it, and the way the room had shifted when he stood up. Not charity, not rescue. Two people arriving at the same calculation from different directions. What happened next would depend on whether the calculation held. She closed her eyes, and somewhere below the house was settling into itself for the night, and she let herself do the same. The first resistance came from a hand named Dale Purvis. Dale was 34, had been with the Croft operation for 3 years, and had developed during the years of household drift the working assumption that the domestic side of the ranch operated under different rules, looser ones, the kind that bent according to whoever pushed hardest. He came into the kitchen on a Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock looking for something to eat, and when Clara told him meals ran at 6, noon, and 6 in the evening, he looked at her the way men look at obstacles they consider temporary. "I've always been able to come in and get something," he said. "I understand that," Clara said, without stopping what she was doing. "That's going to change. The kitchen is a working space. Outside of meal times, it needs to be clear so it can function. Mr. Croft hasn't said anything about this." "Mr. Croft hired me to manage the household," she said. "If you'd like to discuss it with him, his office is at the front of the house." She met his eyes briefly. "But I'd recommend you think about whether that's a conversation you want to have." Purvis's jaw tightened. He was the kind of man who wasn't accustomed to having his leverage handed back to him. He looked at her for a moment longer, and then walked out. She heard 2 days later from Dottie that he'd gone to Amos rather than Elias, and that Amos had told him, with his characteristic economy of words, that the arrangement stood and he should get used to it. Purvis did not come back to the kitchen outside of meal hours again. He was not warm toward her, and she hadn't expected warmth. She needed compliance, and compliance she had. The mornings became the working rhythm of the arrangement. Elias appeared at the kitchen table at 6:15 every day without announcement, and Clara always had coffee made. And without either of them proposing it formally, the 20 minutes between his arrival and the start of the working day became the meeting where everything that needed covering was covered. She found him, in these conversations, to be almost precisely what he had presented himself as being at the placement office: direct, practical, carrying 20 years of unchallenged assumptions that had calcified in places they shouldn't have. She pushed on those places carefully, not to win, but because wrong assumptions had real costs. "The grain order," she said one morning in December, 3 months after her arrival. "You're ordering the same volume as last year." "Same as every year," he said. "You've added storage capacity twice in the last 4 years, which means your effective winter capacity is higher, but your ordering hasn't adjusted. You're leaving money on the table, buying in smaller quantities at the end of winter when supply is tight and prices are up, when you could be buying in volume in fall when it's cheaper." He looked up from the accounts ledger he'd brought to the table. "Where did you get the purchase records?" "The storage files." "The ones in the second drawer of your desk that haven't been organized since 1896? She poured her own coffee. "If you adjust the fall order by 30% and pre-position the storage correctly, you'll save roughly what it costs to run the bunkhouse for 2 months. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him running the numbers. "You're right," he said. "I'll send the amended order today." She added 15% to her estimate when she wrote it up, because the fall had been drier than usual, and prices would reflect it, and she had learned that conservative calculations were usually wrong in the wrong direction. What she had not anticipated was the response it would produce in him. "You added to the number I said," he told her the following morning. "Yes." "Why?" "Because the dry fall means everyone will be in the same situation come February. Prices will be higher than a normal year. The conservative estimate was too conservative." Numb. He held her gaze for a moment. Then something in his face shifted, not surprise exactly, but the specific look of a man revising his understanding of what he's working with. "What else are you seeing that I'm not?" he asked. She told him. It took 40 minutes, and he didn't interrupt once. That was the morning she understood that whatever this arrangement was going to become, it had already moved past what she'd been told to expect from it. The spring brought mud and longer days, and a shift in the household's texture that was not dramatic, but was real. The sense of a system that had found its equilibrium. Clara had reorganized the storage, restructured the ordering, established a kitchen schedule that the men had stopped resisting and had quietly begun to rely on. The meals were good, which carried more weight in a bunkhouse culture than almost anything else. And then in April, she noticed she was tired in a way that was different. She sat with the knowledge for 2 weeks before she let herself take it seriously. Then she drove into Dodge Falls on a supply run and stopped at the office of Dr. Henry Marsh, who had the blunt efficiency of a man who had been practicing medicine in a frontier town for 20 years and had decided that people deserved accurate information more than comfortable ones. She told him what she was experiencing. He examined her with professional precision, asked 3 questions, and then sat back in his chair with the expression of a man confronting data that didn't fit his existing file. "Mrs. Voss," he said carefully, "when were you told you were unable to conceive?" "After my first year of marriage." The physician in Wichita was clear about it. She kept her voice steady. He attributed it to an infection I'd had at 17. Marsh nodded slowly. "I can't speak to that assessment." He paused. "What I can tell you is what I'm seeing now. You are approximately 8 weeks along. The pregnancy appears to be progressing without complication." He looked at her directly. "I'm not going to make promises, because the early weeks carry their own uncertainty, and you know that. But what I'm seeing is a healthy pregnancy." Clara sat in his office chair for a long moment. The afternoon light came through the window and lay across the desk in a pale stripe. She looked at it. "All right," she said. "Thank you." She drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon with the supply wagon and the knowledge sitting in her chest like something with no good word for it yet. Not happiness. It was too loaded and too new for simple happiness. Not fear, though there was some of that. Something more complicated. Something that needed time. That evening, she asked Elias to stay at the table after supper. He stayed. He looked at her and waited, because he had learned in 8 months that she said things when she was ready, and that pressing her before that point produced nothing useful. "I went to see Dr. Marsh today," she said, Something moved in his face. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." She folded her hands on the table. "I went because there was something I needed to know." She looked at him. "I'm pregnant." The word settled into the kitchen. Elias sat very still for a long moment. She watched the information move through him, not dramatically, because he was not a dramatic man, but she could see it working in him, the quiet, seismic quality of a fact that restructures the landscape of what a person thought they understood. "You were told," he started. "I was told. I'm telling you what Dr. Marsh told me today." He was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough for her to hear the wind outside change direction. Then he did something she did not expect. He reached across the table, a deliberate motion, slow and slightly unpracticed, the movement of someone who has decided to do something they don't normally do, and is doing it anyway, and he put his hand over hers. Not briefly. He left it there for a moment, with the weight of someone who means it. His hand was large and work-worn and warm, and it was the first time he had touched her with anything other than the accidental proximity of shared work. "All right," he said, and then quietly, "Are you scared?" She looked at his hand on hers and then at his face. "Yes," she said. "So am I," he said. And the honesty of it, the fact that he said it plainly, without softening it or folding it into something more manageable, was the thing that finally undid the last careful distance she had been maintaining between what this was and what it might become. "Good," she said. "That seems like the right response." He didn't move his hand right away. They sat like that in the quiet kitchen for a moment. Two practical people who had been building something together for 8 months and were now looking at what it had become and finding it larger than either of them had planned for. Then he said he needed to check on the horses and stood up and walked out. And through the window she saw him cross the yard in the dark, and she understood that he had gone somewhere private to feel something he hadn't expected to be feeling, and she respected him for knowing that he needed to. She got up and banked the fire for the night. Her hands moved through the familiar motions. She thought about the placement office, about standing outside in the November wind and deciding, on the basis of 40 minutes of conversation with a stranger, that the honesty was real. She thought she had made the right call, and she thought it with a specific quality, not the bright certainty of hope, but the steadier certainty of someone who has tested something from multiple angles and found it solid. That was enough. That had always, she had found, been enough to work with. The boy was born on a Thursday morning in late November, delivered by Dr. Marsh during a windstorm that turned the yard to dust before anyone had finished breakfast. They named him Caleb, a name Clara had always thought sounded like someone who intended to arrive and stay. Elias had said it was a good name, plain and serious, and that had been the whole of the conversation about it. Caleb was healthy. Clara was exhausted and intact, which was more than she had allowed herself to assume during the final weeks. When the two things she'd been told about her own body had pressed on each other in the dark hours and left her uncertain which one to believe, Elias stood in the bedroom doorway and looked at the child for a long time. "He's got your hands," Clara said. "My hands are not a gift," Elias said. "They're capable," she said. "That's a gift." He came in and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms with the careful practicality of someone handing over something irreplaceable. And she watched his face do something she had not yet seen it do in the 14 months she had known him. Not soften, that was never the right word for what happened to Elias Croft when something mattered to him. But open, the way a thing opens when the pressure that's been holding it together realizes it no longer needs to. "Caleb," he said quietly. The baby's eyes were closed. He was completely indifferent to the wind and the man holding him and the weight of the moment. He was simply present, warm and new and breathing, which was all he needed to be. The trouble arrived 6 months later, in the form of a polite letter that concealed its intentions in formal language. It was from an attorney in Wichita representing a land speculator named George Aldis, who had spent the previous 2 years acquiring distressed properties along the eastern corridor north of Dodge Falls, positioning himself for a railway easement that everyone knew was coming but that hadn't yet been officially surveyed. The letter alleged that 14 acres along the Croft operation's northern boundary were improperly titled, traceable to an 1,882 territorial survey that Aldis claimed had never been formally recorded against the county's amended plat. Clara read the letter twice at the kitchen table and then read it again that evening. It was a sophisticated piece of work. The documentation was real. The chain of title Aldis cited existed. What was debatable, what would need to be demonstrated, was whether the 1,882 survey had been superseded by the 1,887 county replating, which had amended the relevant boundaries and should, if Clara was reading the language correctly, have rendered Aldis's claim moot before it was ever filed. Elias's reaction was controlled fury, which she had learned was how he expressed strong emotion. Everything pressed inward, nothing released outward, so that what you saw was not the anger but the edges of it. 14 acres, he said. I've been running cattle on that land for 16 years. He's not interested in the 14 acres, Clara said. He's interested in the railway easement. If the Northern Corridor survey comes through where everyone expects it to, that parcel becomes worth 10 times its current value. He can be interested in it from Wichita. We need a lawyer, she said. Someone who knows county plat law specifically. She set down the letter. And I need to see every original document from your 1,884 purchase. Not summaries, the actual filings. He looked at her steadily. You're going to read them. I read everything, she said. That hasn't changed. What she found over the following 4 weeks working at the kitchen table in the early mornings before the house woke, with the original county filings spread around the lamp and Caleb asleep in the next room, was that Aldis had made an assumption he had no reason to expect would be challenged. The 1,882 survey he cited had been conducted under a territorial provision that required reaffirmation within 5 years to remain actionable against a subsequent county plat. The provision was buried in 4 paragraphs of standard language that most people, reading the document, would have treated as boilerplate. It was not boilerplate. The prior holder had never reaffirmed. The 1,882 survey had lapsed on its own terms in 1887, the same year the county replating had taken effect. Aldis's entire claim was built on an interest that had expired 13 years before he purchased it. The lawyer, she and Elias, hired a careful and specific man named Robert Eves from the county seat, went through her analysis with the focused attention of someone encountering work that is better than expected and is deciding how to respond to that fact. You found the reaffirmation provision, he said. It took 4 readings, Clara said. The language is genuinely opaque. It's designed to be, Eves said. Speculators who work this kind of claim count on the provision being missed. He looked at his copy of the filing. This is dispositive, Mrs. Croft. He had begun using that name some weeks ago without discussion, and she had not corrected him. I don't believe this needs to go to trial. He was right. Aldis's attorneys, presented with the documented lapse in advance of the scheduled hearing, withdrew the complaint within 10 days. A document arrived. Eves sent word. Elias read the letter at the breakfast table and set it down and looked at Clara. It's done, he said. Yes. How did you find the reaffirmation provision? I read everything, she said. Which was the same answer she had given him when he'd asked what she was going to do, and which would remain her answer as long as he continued to be surprised by it. He was quiet for a moment. You know what Eves told me, Elias said, when I spoke with him after. He said he's been practicing county law for 18 years and had never seen a client come in with that level of preparation. He looked at his coffee. I'm not sure I've told you clearly enough what you've done here. You let me do it, she said. That's the part most men get wrong. He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize, the one that meant he was seeing something and adjusting something and was going to carry the adjustment forward without fanfare. It was one of his better qualities, she had decided. The willingness to revise without needing to be seen doing it. I mean it, he said, as a partner, not as a compliment, as an accurate statement of what this has been. The word partner sat between them on the table. I know you mean it, she said. That's why I'm still here. A pause, and in the pause, something that had been present for a long time between them and that neither of them had named, because naming it had seemed like a risk, they were separately still deciding whether to take. Clara, he said. And then he stopped, and she waited, because she had learned that he said important things when he was ready, and that the waiting was part of the respect. I wasn't sure, he said, when I stood up in that room. I knew what I needed practically, and I knew I was tired of pretending the practical was the whole of it. He looked at her steadily. And then I watched you standing there, not looking at the floor, and I thought that was either the bravest thing I'd seen or the most determined, and I didn't know which. And I wanted to find out. He stopped again. I've been finding out every morning since. She held his gaze for a long moment. What did you find? She said. Both, he said. Brave and determined. and stubborn and right more often than is convenient. And he paused. And the pause was the most he had ever visibly worked at something in her presence, and someone I did not expect. Someone who changed what I thought was possible to have in this life. The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the range had burned to coals, and the light was low and amber, and made the room feel smaller and more complete than it was. "I didn't expect you either," she said. "I thought the honesty was performance. I kept waiting for it to stop." She looked at him. "It didn't stop." "No," he said. "It doesn't." She reached across the table and turned his hand over on the tabletop and set her hand in his, which was a more deliberate gesture than his had been in November, and which they both understood as such. He closed his fingers around hers with the careful certainty of a man holding something he intends to keep. They sat like that for a while, in the kitchen where all their mornings had been, with the wind doing what the Kansas wind always did outside, and Caleb beginning to make the sounds of waking in the next room, and the account still open on the table, and everything ordinary, continuing to be ordinary around them. Which was, she had come to understand, exactly how the real things announce themselves. Not in the extraordinary moments, in the accumulated weight of ordinary mornings, each one chosen, each one another day of someone deciding that what they were building was worth showing up for. She kept the ranch. She kept the accounts and the supply orders and the correspondence with 3 other operations she'd begun quietly advising on household management, because word had traveled the way it traveled in small counties sideways, through people who had been helped and told someone else who needed it. She kept the kitchen running on the system she had built from scratch in her first week, which by now ran so smoothly it barely needed her direct attention. She kept the hard conversations at the breakfast table, the ones where she told Elias he was wrong and he listened, which was rarer in the world than it should have been. Caleb learned to walk on the kitchen floor she had scrubbed into usefulness. He learned to talk, asking questions about the horses and the grain bins and the column of numbers in the account ledger that his mother was always working on when he climbed into the chair beside her. He was 3 years old when he told her that the number in the bottom row didn't look right, and she looked at it and discovered he was correct, which she logged as both a bookkeeping error and a piece of information about her son. The century turned. The trains came through the northern corridor exactly as everyone had predicted, and the 14 acres that George Aldous had tried to take were worth, by 1902, 7 times what they had been. The Croft operation held clear title, and Elias did not discuss Aldis's name, and neither did Clara, except once, when a woman in town asked her how she had managed it. "I read the documents," Clara said. The woman looked at her. "All of them," Clara said. "Every word." Elias turned 68 in the spring of 1906, and the children, Caleb, 7 now, and his sister June, who had arrived in 1903, with a disposition that had announced itself loudly from her first hour and had not moderated, gave him a supper that Clara made with more care than the usual weeknight, and June drew him a picture of a horse that looked more like a horse than anything her age should have produced, and Caleb sat beside him and told him, with the serious attention of a boy who had been observing the operation for 7 years, exactly why he thought the new storage rotation was more efficient than the old one. Elias looked at his son for a long moment. "He's your child," he said to Clara across the table. "He's ours," she said. "The part that reads the accounts is yours. The part that already knows he's right before he's proven it," she said, "is yours." June said loudly that she wanted to drive the wagon by herself. "You're 4, Elias said. "Almost 5, June said. "There's a difference." Clara looked at her daughter at the specific quality of the certainty in her, the way she announced herself to a room and thought about a livery stable in 1899, and a platform, and a woman who had refused to look at the floor. She thought about what it meant to give that quality to a child who had never had reason to suppress it. "There is a difference," Clara said. "We'll start practicing next spring." June looked at her with the expression of someone who has just been given something real. Elias looked at Clara with the expression of a man who has spent 7 years finding out something and has arrived, not at a conclusion, but at the ongoing satisfaction of a thing that keeps being true. "Next spring," he said. Outside, the Kansas wind moved across the flat land the way it always had, enormous and indifferent, not caring in the least what happened inside the houses that people built to hold against it. But the house was warm, and there were children in it, and the accounts were in order, and the title on 4,200 acres was clean. And two people who had walked out of a placement office on a November morning in 1899, one of them having paid $1 for a conversation, the other having decided the conversation was worth having, were still at the kitchen table, still working, still building, still, every ordinary morning, showing up, which was the whole of it, which had always been enough. Sometimes, the most important thing two people can do is simply decide to take each other seriously, not because the circumstances are perfect, not because the future is certain, but because the work itself is worth showing up for. Clara didn't wait to be rescued. Elias didn't wait to be ready. They just kept choosing, every ordinary morning, to build something honest together. That kind of quiet courage is available to all of us, every single day. A small note for you, this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of entertainment while also sharing a small, sincere lesson about what it truly means to build a life worth living.